Okay, let's start talking about roughages a little bit. And here's what we know. We know that roughages are bulky feeds, meaning they take up a lot of space. We know they're high in fiber, they're low in energy. And we use these mainly in herbivore rations, especially our ruminant, but we do feed some non-ruminants like our horses, especially I guess would be the non-ruminants that we feed it to. Nutrients are utilized by microbial digestion, and we know that they have to be included in our ruminant diets. All ruminants we know have to have some form of a roughage because they need that fiber in their ration. We know that there are several different types. Forages are standing roughages that animals go and graze. They could be grasses, they could be legumes, they could be a mix of the two. Hay is nothing more than a dehydrated forage that we have cut. We've allowed it to cure and dehydrate, and then we've baled it up, or we've stored it, or we've piled it to use at a later date. Silage is similar in the fact that we have harvested it, but we harvest silage in a wet state. And then we usually store that silage in an airtight condition, and that way it can ferment and get into a stable state so we can use that silage later on. And then we have residues. An example of a residue would be corn stalks. So we harvest the corn, the grain, and the stalk is left over, and then we can go through and either bale up those stalks or we can graze cows on it. Straw, beet tops, down south they do this with peanuts. They harvest the peanuts and then they make hay or graze the residue that's left over from the peanuts. Forages are plants grown specifically for feeding animals, and they could be cultivated or they could be naturally growing. We know that in the western United States and the plain states, we're blessed with millions of acres of grasslands, and we can harvest that grass with livestock, and those are great sources for many of these ruminant animals to convert those forages over into other substances that we can use. The major component of forages is the carbohydrate cellulose. Now, cellulose is very hard to digest. Humans cannot digest cellulose. We also know that cellulose is the most abundant organic compound on the face of the earth. Our herbivore animals, and especially our ruminants, can digest that and convert it into other things. A cellulose is a very complicated carbohydrate that's made up of many glucose molecules that are bonded together. And it's the way they're bonded that make them very difficult for us to actually digest. The only practical way for humans to utilize cellulose is by consuming animals who have converted that cellulose from a carbohydrate into other things like proteins and fats and milk that we can get a value out of. Okay, so forages have a very high level of cell wall. We know that plant cells are different than animal cells, and that cell wall can be a very complicated or a very hard membrane to fix. So the cell wall is made up of very fibrous materials, things like lignin, cellulose, as we've already talked about, hemicelluloses, and in some plants we can actually see that they have silica, and a silica would be like a sand, and so almost very abrasive. This chart right here tells us a little bit more about how plants mature and how they actually can be digested. So if we look at a plant up here, would be an early maturity, a young plant. We can see that it has a thinner cell wall, this yellow part, and the green part represents the solubles. Those would be waters and digestible things within the plant. A mature plant or late in maturity, we notice there's a lot more yellow and a much smaller green part. And so we have a much thicker cell wall. On the early maturity or the young plant, we have a low NDF number. And we're going to talk more about that NDF number when we start talking about hay. But NDF is a measurement of the amount or rate of speed of intake. So if we have a low NDF, we have high intake. If we have a high NDF, thick walls or cell walls help us know that those have a low intake. So down here, this chart tells us a little bit more. We see that a low NDF number indicates we have more sugars, more starches, more fats, more proteins, that we have a higher level of intake. If this NDF number was higher, the opposite is true, so we'd have less of these things and we'd have a lower intake. And so for instance at home, I'm feeding some cows right now on a bale feeder, barley hay. It has a higher NDF. Okay, it's still good in terms of protein. And so what it does though is those cows don't go through the hay near as fast as they would if I put in some alfalfa. Alfalfa would have a lower NDF number, meaning that they could eat it much quicker. We know that the ruminant digestive tract has a filter in there that keeps hard to digest fibers from passing through in the digestive tract. So things that are complicated to digest are going to stay in the rumen much longer until they're broken down into smaller fibers and they're able to pass through.